The Book of the Dead is a sacred text that unveils the mysteries of the afterlife. How did the Egyptians prepare for their journey to the other world? Who wrote this book, and why was it so important? What's the difference between the Egyptian and Tibetan books of the dead? Today, we'll dive into these questions. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead isn't really a book about death. It's a book about life overcoming death. Strangely enough, its dramatic title, which has become as iconic of ancient Egypt as pyramids, mummies, and papyrus, doesn't accurately reflect the content or the idea behind the work. In fact, it's quite the opposite of its true name. The title Book of the Dead is a direct translation from the Arabic Kitab al-Mayyit, the Book of a Dead Person. Modern Egyptians use this term to refer to the papyrus scrolls with mysterious writings and drawings that they found with the mummies of their distant ancestors. Of course, they had no idea what the texts actually contained. Long ago, ancient Egypt was seen by Europeans as a land of death, where people worshipped death and spent their lives preparing to die. Perhaps that's why the name Book of the Dead became so closely associated with this funerary text, even though Egyptologists know that this title is more than a little misleading. The true title of the work was The Spells for Going Forth into the Light. This reflects the main essence of this remarkable text, to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the afterlife, pass the judgment, and return to the earth, which means to live again, to resurrect, to renew, to conquer death, so that they may lead a spiritual and sensory existence in a rejuvenated, beautiful, ageless body on a forever fertile land, surrounded by loved ones. This book is about overcoming death, about triumphing over it, and also about how to do it. The history of the Book of the Dead dates back to an infinitely distant time when the primitive religious ideas of the ancient inhabitants of the Nile Valley began to evolve into a more complex cult of local gods, forming the foundations of their burial rituals. It seems that even before the unification of Egypt into one state, in the pre-literate period, a collection of funerary formulas began to emerge, which much later, under the pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties, were inscribed on the walls of the burial chambers of royal pyramids. The first time this happened was during the reign of Pharaoh Unas, at the very end of the Old Kingdom. The Book of the Dead emerged from concepts depicted in tomb drawings and inscriptions as far back as Egypt's 3rd dynasty. By the 12th dynasty, these spells, accompanied by illustrations, were written on papyrus and placed in tombs and graves along with the deceased. Their purpose was to teach the dead how to overcome the dangers of the afterlife, allowing them to take on the forms of various mythical creatures and providing them with the keys needed to enter specific stages of the underworld. However, they also served to ensure that the soul knew in advance what to expect at each stage. At some point before our era, various spells were divided into chapters. By the time of the New Kingdom, the book had become extremely popular. Scribes were often commissioned to create custom books for each individual or even entire families. These key spells weren't part of any ritual but were tailored for a specific deceased person to be recited in the afterlife. If someone was ill and feared death, they would go to a scribe and ask him to write a book of spells. The scribe needed to know the life the person had led to guess what journey might await them after death, and then create the appropriate spells. With the end of the Middle Kingdom, the conclusion of the victorious struggle against the Hyksos invaders, and the formation of the empire, a new period began in the development of religious literature. During this time, funerary texts written on papyrus became accessible to almost all layers of society. As in the previous era, a main collection of funerary texts was compiled, replacing the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom. By the very end of this period, the first papyrus scrolls appeared, and with the 18th dynasty, they became widespread. From this time on, religious texts concerning the underworld were compiled and written in the form we now know as the Book of the Dead. Every Egyptian who could afford to pay a scribe, even for the most basic list of sacred texts, would take a papyrus scroll with them to the grave. This scroll could be a short excerpt containing only the most essential chapters, or it could be an extensive work, stretching dozens of meters and encompassing all the wisdom the scribe knew. Before the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead was accessible only to royalty and the elite. The popularity of the Osiris myth during the New Kingdom made people believe that having the book was necessary, as Osiris played a crucial role in the judgment of the soul in the afterlife. As more people desired their own copy, scribes began to emphasize its importance, and the book became just another commodity produced for sale. Of course, making papyrus scrolls was much less expensive, time-consuming, and resource-intensive than decorating large wooden boxes. It's also important to remember that during the New Kingdom, anthropoid coffins, shaped like the human body, became common, and these were not suitable for lengthy inscriptions. The new papyrus collection was produced almost on an assembly line, with space left blank for the buyer's name. The vast majority of copies were made this way. In the Book of the Dead, you won't find ideas like the cannibalistic hymn from the pyramid texts, where the deceased king devours the gods. Nor will you see statements describing the fear he instills in them. Here, the relationship with the gods is quite different. In the Book of the Dead, the gods are impartial judges before whom the deceased must account for their earthly deeds. One could try to ease their fate with magical spells, memorizing or reading scrolls with the names of all the gods they would encounter, thereby gaining some power over them. You could even place a scarab on your heart to keep it silent about your wrongdoings when the time came to answer for them. Although the Book of the Dead seemingly guaranteed a favorable outcome in the judgment, Egyptians were not entirely confident. What would the divine scales show, where the heart of the deceased is weighed before the god Thoth, who is said to have written the Book of the Dead and created all its spells? The righteous clearly had a better chance of eternal bliss. It's no surprise that the collection included the chapters of justification and the so-called negative confession, where the deceased swears that they have committed no evil deeds. This served as a kind of moral code for the ancient Egyptians during the New Kingdom. Scribes offered clients various sets to choose from. Their books contained as many spells as the client could afford. A person could decide how many chapters to include in the book, what illustrations to have, and the quality of the papyrus to use. The only limitation was their financial means. From the New Kingdom to the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Book of the Dead was created in this way. It continued to evolve in form and size until 650 BCE, when it was standardized to include 190 uniform spells. However, people could still add or remove content as they saw fit. In the Book of the Dead from the Ptolemaic period, belonging to a woman named Tintiret, the lamentations of Isis and Nephthys were included, even though they were not part of the Book of the Dead before. However, one specific spell was always present in every copy, spell 125. Spell 125 is the most famous of all the texts in the Book of the Dead. Even people unfamiliar with the book but with some knowledge of Egyptian mythology likely know it. Spell 125 describes the weighing of the heart of the deceased by Osiris in the Hall of Truth, one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt, even though the god with the scales is never mentioned in this specific text. Since passing the heart-weighing test was essential for gaining entry to paradise, knowing what to say and how to behave before Thoth, Osiris, Anubis, and the 42 judges was considered the most crucial information the deceased could have. When a person died, Anubis guided them to the Hall of Truth, also known as the Hall of Two Truths, where they had to make the negative confession, also known as the Declaration of Innocence. This was a list of 42 sins that the individual could honestly claim they had never committed. After the confession, Thoth, Osiris, Anubis, and the 42 judges would deliberate. If the confession was accepted, the deceased's heart would be weighed on a scale against the white feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul would pass into paradise. If it was heavier, the heart was thrown to the ground where it was devoured by the goddess Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. Spell 125 begins with a message to the reader, that is, the soul. It instructs what to say upon arriving in this hall of justice, cleansing the person's name of all evil deeds they may have committed, and facing the gods. The spell then guides the soul on what exactly to say when meeting Osiris. Praise to you, great God, Lord of double truth. I have come to you, my Lord. You have brought me to behold your beauty. I know you, I know your name. I know the names of the 42 gods who are with you in the hall of double truth, who live by hunting down the wicked and feeding on their blood on the day of reckoning in the presence of the good one. Behold, I have come to you, Lord of truth. I have brought truth and driven away falsehood. I have not done wrong to people. I have not committed what is abominable to the gods. I have not killed. I have not diminished the offerings in temples. I have not reduced the food of the gods. I have not stolen funerary offerings from the deceased. I have not cheated in measurements of grain. I have not altered the length of measures. I have not violated the boundaries of fields. I have not cheated with weights. I have not tampered with the scales. I am pure. After this prologue, the soul recites the negative confession and undergoes questioning by the gods and the 42 judges. At this stage, very specific information was needed to justify oneself before the gods. The soul had to know the names of various gods and their responsibilities, as well as details like the names of the doors in the chamber and the floor upon which they walked. They even needed to know the names of their own feet. When the soul answered each deity and object correctly, they would receive the response, "You know us, pass by us." At one point, the soul had to answer a question about its feet. "I will not let you walk on me," said the floor of this hall of justice. "Why?" "I am pure. Because I do not know the names of your feet, with which you intend to step on me. Tell me their names." "The secret image of Ha is the name of my right foot. The flower of Hathor is the name of my left foot. You know us, step over us." At the end of the spell, there is a description of how the soul should be dressed when facing judgment and how to recite the spell. The proper procedure in this hall of justice: the one who recites this spell must be pure and innocent, clothed in white garments and sandals, adorned with black eye paint and anointed with myrrh. They must be offered meat and fowl, incense, bread, beer, and herbs when this written procedure is placed on a clean floor of ochre, covered with earth, which has not been trodden by the feet of pigs or small livestock. After this, the scribe who wrote the spell congratulates himself on a job well done and assures the reader that the scribe will prosper, as will his children, for his role in creating the spell. He claims that all will be well when he himself comes to judgment, will be ushered in with the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, and will be in the entourage of Osiris. Providing the spell made the scribe part of the inner workings of the afterlife. This meant he was assured a favorable reception in the underworld and could pass into paradise ahead of others. For an ordinary person, or even a ruler, this was no simple task. But if they answered all these questions correctly, had a heart lighter than the feather of truth, and were kind to the grim divine ferryman who transported souls across the lake of lilies, they could find themselves in paradise. The Egyptian field of reeds, sometimes called the field of offerings, was exactly the place a person left behind in life. Upon arriving there, the soul would reunite with lost loved ones and even beloved pets. The soul would settle in the likeness of the home they always knew, with the same courtyard, the same trees, the same birds singing in the evening and morning, and would enjoy this forever in the presence of the gods. The contents of the Book of the Dead can be divided into 4 parts, as categorized by the French Egyptologist Alexandre Moret. Chapters 1 through 16 focus on the funeral procession to the necropolis, prayers for the emergence into the day, and hymns to the sun and Osiris. Chapters 17 to 6-3 cover the emergence into the day and the resurrection of the deceased, their victory over the forces of darkness, the powerlessness of their enemies, and the deceased's control over the elements. Chapters 64 to 129 describe the emergence into the day, the deceased's transformation into a deity, their inclusion on the solar bark, their knowledge of various mysteries, their return to the tomb, and the judgment in the afterlife. Finally, chapters 130 to 162 are devoted to the glorification of the deceased. The texts intended for reading throughout the year, on specific holidays, and during the offering days were meant to protect the mummy. The illustrations, of the highest artistic level, played a crucial role alongside the text. These were the first examples of book illustrations in history. Thus, the content was not only expressed in words, but also visually. For the Egyptians, for whom images held great significance, these illustrations were so important that they often preferred to omit text rather than leave out the artwork due to space constraints. During the 21st dynasty, there even appeared versions of the Book of the Dead that consisted solely of illustrations. The nature of Egyptian pictorial writing was such that the images on the pages of the Book of the Dead were almost as readable to the Egyptians as the regular text. In this respect, the illustrations were more informative for contemporary readers than they are for us today. The perilous journeys of the deceased, the mysterious inhabitants of the afterlife, the magical actions of the characters, and the strange objects they wield, all come to life on the papyrus sheets. We are presented with a remarkable world, shaped by millennia of spiritual quests, a world that seems fantastical to us, but was both terrifying and familiar to the ancient Egyptians. The 33 chapters of the Book of the Dead available today, out of the original 193, like the rest, contain numerous references to a wide variety of deities, both well-known and obscure. They also mention myths, some well-known and others lost to time. In its fundamental texts, Egyptian religion remained unchanged from the 5th and 6th dynasties until Christianity spread in Egypt following St. Mark's preaching in Alexandria in 69 AD. Christians in Egypt, known as Copts, were direct descendants of the ancient inhabitants of the Nile Valley. They never fully abandoned the superstitions and mysterious mythological concepts inherited from their distant ancestors. There's no need to rehash evidence supporting this fact or to cite the lives of saints, martyrs, or ascetics. However, it's interesting to note that translators of the New Testament into the Coptic language adapted the Greek word Hades to the Coptic Amenti, the underworld. This was how the ancient Egyptians referred to the place where souls dwelled after death, and the Copts populated their Amenti with beings whose prototypes are found on ancient monuments. The main gods mentioned in the pyramid texts are identical to those whose images are preserved on tomb walls, sarcophagi, and papyri from the later dynasties. While the names of great cosmic deities like Ptah or Khnum were rarely mentioned, the gods of the dead naturally held the central place in funerary literature. The doctrine of eternal life and the resurrection of the enlightened, or the physical transformation, was based on the ancient myth of Osiris's resurrection after his violent death. The legends from the earliest times are repeated in later texts with no significant changes or additions. Amusingly, the story of Osiris is never found in a complete form anywhere in Egyptian literature. Yet, references to the life, suffering, and resurrection of Osiris appear throughout sources from all periods as if they were common knowledge. Greek writers have preserved these traditions about the god in their works. We owe the retelling of this legend to Plutarch, though it's clear that the author was mistaken about certain details, which is understandable given that his account weaves together overlapping traditions spanning several millennia. According to Plutarch, the goddess Rhea, or Nut, the wife of Helios, Ra, was loved by Cronus, Geb. Upon discovering the affair, Helios cursed his wife, declaring that she would not be able to give birth in any month of any year. Hermes, who was also enamored with Rhea, played dice with the universe and won a portion of each day, totaling 5 days. These days were added to the 360 days that then made up the yearly cycle. On the first of these additional days, Osiris was born, and at the moment of his birth, a voice proclaimed that the Lord of creation had arrived. Over time, Osiris became the king of Egypt and dedicated himself to educating his subjects and teaching them the art of agriculture. He established laws and taught people to worship the gods. Having brought prosperity and well-being to Egypt, Osiris took his mission of cultural enlightenment to other lands. During his absence, Isis ruled the country so well that the evil Typhon could not harm the people. However, upon Osiris's return, Typhon, along with 72 accomplices and the queen of Ethiopia, conspired against him. To kill Osiris secretly, Typhon measured his body, made a beautiful chest, and brought it to the banquet hall where Osiris was feasting with his guests. Through trickery, Osiris was made to lie in the chest, which Typhon and his accomplices immediately sealed and transported to the Tanis mouth of the Nile. These events took place on the 17th day of the month of Hathor, during the 28th year of Osiris's reign or his earthly life. The first to learn of what had happened was a satyr living near Panopolis. News finally reached Isis, who was in Coptos at the time. She cut off a lock of her hair, donned mourning attire, and set out to find her husband's body. During her search, she discovered that Osiris had been involved with her sister Nephthys, resulting in the birth of Anubis, a fact that Nephthys revealed shortly after giving birth. With the help of dogs, Isis tracked down the child and began caring for him, raising him to be her protector and companion. Soon, she learned that the chest had been washed ashore by the waves near the city of Byblos, where it had become lodged among the branches of a tamarisk tree. Over time, the tamarisk grew in such a remarkable way that the chest ended up inside the tree's trunk. The king of the area, impressed by the unusual tree, ordered it to be cut down and turned into a pillar to support the roof of his house. Isis learned of this, traveled to Byblos, and gained access to the palace through the palace maidens. She managed to secure a position as a nurse to one of the royal sons. Instead of feeding the child in the usual way, Isis allowed him to suckle on her finger and placed him in a blazing fire each night to perfect his mortal body. Meanwhile, she transformed into a swallow and mourned her fate. However, one night, the queen saw her son in the fire, cried out loudly, and prevented him from attaining immortality. Isis revealed her true identity to the queen and requested the pillars supporting the roof. She split it open, extracted the chest containing her husband's body, and wept so bitterly that one of the royal children died of fright. Isis then transported the chest back to Egypt, where she opened it and tearfully embraced her husband's body. From her dead husband, she conceived a son, Horus, in the city of Buto in Lower Egypt and hid the chest in a secure place. However, one night, while hunting under the bright moon, Typhon discovered the chest, recognized the body of the slain Osiris, and cut it into 14 pieces, scattering them across the country. Upon hearing this, Isis took a boat made of papyrus, a plant repulsive to crocodiles, and sailed the river, collecting the fragments of Osiris's body. Wherever she found a piece, she built a tomb. When Horus grew up and received the blessing of Osiris, who had returned from the other world, he challenged Typhon, the murderer of his father, to a battle. Their struggle lasted many days, and Typhon was eventually captured. However, Isis, who was entrusted with guarding her nephew, went against her son Horus's interests and set Typhon free. In his fury, Horus tore the royal diadem from her head, but Thoth provided her with a helmet shaped like a cow's head. In two subsequent battles between Horus and Set, Horus emerged victorious. This is the story of Osiris's passion as told by Plutarch. Through the suffering and death of Osiris, the Egyptians hoped to attain physical resurrection in a transformed and enlightened body. They prayed to him, the one who had conquered death and become the king of the realm of the dead, for eternal life. In all the funerary texts known to us, from the pyramid texts to the crude inscriptions on tombs, it is stated that what was done for Osiris was also done for the deceased. The state of Osiris was declared to be the state of the deceased. In other words, the deceased was identified with Osiris. Just as Osiris lives eternally, so too will the deceased live. If Osiris dies, then the deceased will also perish. By the beginning of the 20th dynasty, Osiris was called the King of Eternity, the Lord of Infinity, who spans millions of years of life, the firstborn son of Nut, conceived by Geb, foremost among gods and men, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Princes, ruler of the world. He was the sole master of the earth on both sides of the heavenly Nile. During the 25th dynasty, a literary movement emerged, represented by works such as the Book of Breathing, the veneration of Isis and Nephthys, the festive songs of Isis and Nephthys, the lamentations of Saqqara, and others. These works contain prayers and hymns addressed to Osiris, the Lord of the Dead, the symbol of resurrection, and the successor of the great cosmic god Adamare. He was revered as the soul that repeats life, the one who becomes a child again, the formless firstborn, the Lord of countless forms, the master of time and the predetermined years of life, the Lord of eternal life. He is the one who gives life from its very beginning. Life descends upon us from his destruction. The seed that came from him provides life to both the living and the dead. The negative confession is a list of 42 sins. The most famous list is found in the Papyrus of Ani, a text from the Egyptian Book of the Dead compiled for the Theban scribe Ani and included among the burial items in his tomb. It contains some chapters from the Book of the Dead, but not all. These omissions are not mistakes, nor were the manuscripts lost. The text represented a common practice of creating a personalized book. The negative confession included in this text follows the same paradigm, as it was written specifically for Ani, not for anyone else. It is believed that the confession originated from a ritual for the ordination of priests. It is said that priests had to recite a certain formulaic list to prove that they were ritually pure and worthy of their calling. Although there is some evidence to support this claim, the negative confession in its current form emerged during the New Kingdom of Egypt, when the cult of Osiris had fully integrated into Egyptian culture, as a way for the deceased to justify themselves as worthy of paradise in the afterlife. There is no standard version of the confession. The confession from the Papyrus of Ani is the most well-known only because this text is so famous and frequently cited. The standard number of confessions is 42, but the sins listed vary from text to text. For example, in the Papyrus of Ani, confession number 15 states, "I have not acted with deceit," in another place, "I have not commanded to kill," and in a third, "I have not argued over matters." A military officer could not honestly claim, "I have not commanded to kill," just as a judge or king could not, and therefore this sin would be excluded from their confession. This was less about benefiting the deceased and more about ensuring that a person did not condemn themselves by telling a lie. After all, the heart would still be weighed on the scales, and any deception would be revealed. Therefore, instead of a standard list of sins that everyone had to recite, the soul was given a list that allowed it to speak truthfully before the gods. Nevertheless, each list contained standard sins, such as "I have not stolen," "I have not slandered," "I have not caused pain," and other similar statements. It is also believed that, in many cases, these statements carried implicit qualifications. For instance, Confession 10 in some texts states, "I have not caused anyone to cry." But this is a very contentious claim, as a person often does not know how their actions have affected others. Thus, it is believed that the true meaning of this statement is, "I have not intentionally caused anyone to cry." The purpose of the confession was to honestly declare one's innocence in actions that contradicted the principle of Ma'at. Therefore, regardless of the specific sins included, the person needed to be able to truthfully claim that they were not guilty of intentionally violating the guiding principle of harmony and balance in life. Ma'at was the central cultural value of ancient Egypt, through which the universe functioned. By making the confession, the soul was declaring that it adhered to this principle and that any mistakes were unintentional. In the next part of the confession, Ani addresses each of the 42 judges in hopes that they will recognize his intentions in life, even if he didn't always make the right choices at the right time. It was believed that sins of omission were not considered. Each confession is preceded by a greeting directed at a specific judge and the region from which they originated. Some of these regions are not on Earth, but in the afterlife. For example, the judge greeted as number 12 is a divine ferryman in the underworld. Thus, in Ani's case, the 42 names are not fully represented. Some of them are mentioned twice, but the standard number of 42 is still maintained. Drunkenness was tolerated in ancient Egypt, as was premarital sex, but only under certain conditions. You could get as drunk as you wanted at festivals, but not at work. And you could have as much premarital sex as you wanted, but not with someone who was already married. The same was true for same-sex relationships. Interestingly, there is no condemnation of them in Egyptian literature or religious texts. The Egyptians valued individuality. Their burial rituals and concepts of the afterlife were based on this very idea. Inscriptions on tombs, monuments, autobiographies, even the Great Pyramid itself, all were achievements of the individual. The negative confession followed the same model, as it was shaped by the character, lifestyle, and recognition of each person. It was assumed that any worthy person would be justified in the afterlife and that, regardless of their personal flaws, they would be allowed to continue their journey to paradise. However, between arriving in the Hall of Truth and the journey to paradise, the soul could make many missteps. The Book of the Dead contains spells for all kinds of situations, but it doesn't guarantee that one will survive these twists and turns. Egypt has a long history, and like any other culture, its beliefs evolved over time. Not all the details I've mentioned earlier were included in the vision of every era of Egyptian history. In some periods, the changes were minor, while in others, the afterlife was viewed as a dangerous journey to paradise. In certain periods, the path to paradise was straightforward once the soul was justified by Osiris. In others, crocodiles could obstruct the soul, demons would appear to deceive or even attack. In these cases, the soul needed a spell to survive and reach its destination. The spells included in the book have names like to repel a crocodile that came to take away, to drive away a snake, and so on. The Book of the Dead, as noted, was never used for magical transformations on Earth. The spells only worked in the afterlife. The claim that the Book of the Dead was some sort of sorcerer's text is also inaccurate and unfounded, as is comparing it to the Bible. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is also quite different from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, even though the two are often compared. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is a collection of texts read to a dying or recently deceased person to guide the soul step by step through the process of what happens next. The similarity with the Egyptian work lies in its aim to comfort the soul and guide it from the body to the afterlife. However, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is based on an entirely different belief system. The most significant difference is that it is intended to be read by the living to the dead, rather than being a guide for the dead to read themselves. Both books are cultural constructs designed to make death a more manageable experience. The spells in the Book of the Dead, regardless of the era in which they were written, promised continued existence after death. Just like in life, there were trials, unexpected twists, places to avoid, friends and allies to gain along the way. Ultimately, the soul could hope for a reward for living a good and virtuous life. For those left behind, the spells were interpreted much like how people read horoscopes today. Horoscopes are not written to highlight someone's flaws or to make them feel bad. Similarly, the spells were crafted so that the living could read them, think about their loved one in the afterlife, and feel assured that the deceased had safely reached the field of reeds. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave your comments and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.